Joining me for tonight's Conversations with Great Minds is Kaitlin Barnett. Kaitlin is a journalist, blogger, and author. She writes about mental health topics for the Huffington Post and about young people's experience with medications at My Meds Myself, a blog at the psychology website Psych Central. She's held positions at the Atlanta Constitution-Journal and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and has worked as a freelance journalist for a variety of publications, including the New York Observer and Parents Magazine. She's a graduate of Dartmouth College as well as the Columbia University Journalism School. Kaitlin is also the author of the new book, Dosed, The Medication Generation Grows Up. And she joins us now from our studios in New York City. Kaitlin, welcome.
Hi, Tom. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us tonight. You write that your generation is the first in history to have a significant percentage grow up on psychiatric or psychotropic medications, mind and emotion-altering medications. What does that mean for us as a culture and for the future of your generation?
Well, I think that it means that a significant percentage of people have really had their personalities shaped by these medications. And I think it's hard to say in any one single way what exactly that means, which is why I took an entire book to say it. Different people, I think, are shaped in very different and very diverse ways by these medications. And also, I think it's important to note that, you know, when we say medications as a class, I'm making a generalization, but there are many different kinds of psychotropic medications. We have kinds to treat ADHD, kinds to treat depression, kinds to treat more, you know, severe conditions like bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia. And different medications affect people, as I say, differently depending on their circumstances and the circumstances, you know, under which they're taken. One of the most important things that I think that I would identify just right off the bat is, did the child have a choice in taking the medications? Did they get to ask for them or request them, or was this a coercive situation?
Yeah, you talk about how people are shaped by the medications. The generation that was shaped by the Great Depression is well documented, and the impact that had on them and how it changed and altered their behavior, particularly economically, but socially as well. And then the generation that I grew up with, where in elementary school the bell would go off and we'd jump under our desks and cover our eyes and ears so we wouldn't be blinded by the nuclear flash that, you know, the Soviets were going to get us. Vietnam, these kind of things, these are generational experiential externalities. What you're describing is, maybe for the first time in a long time in our history, arguably some cultures that use psychoactive plants, maybe there might be some kind of an analogy, but this is an internal process. This is going on inside people's heads. What's the difference between the two, and how does that change the outcome?
Yes, I think, Tom, that's a really, really good way of characterizing it, and I think that the fact is that we don't quite know the answer, and one reason that I really wanted to write the book was that we don't know yet exactly how this generation is going to be shaped, because we don't have the scientific evidence to be able to say, how do these drugs affect developing minds and developing bodies? So what I did is I set out to write the book from a very qualitative kind of a standpoint, asking the young people themselves, how did it feel to you in your particular circumstances when you were growing up to take these medications? And so I was telling individual people's stories, and I was trying to extrapolate, of course, from those stories and make some generalizations about the kinds of different realms, like school and relationships, and what it's like to have changing symptoms, for example, and contending with these kinds of disorders. I did want to make a point that the circumstances really make a huge difference, and that sometimes the young people themselves right off the bat didn't know exactly how they'd been affected. They had a gut sense that something had affected them, and it was integral to the way they'd grown up and their sense of self. But when I asked them, they really wanted to talk to me, but they weren't quite sure how it had affected them. And so I think it is in some ways open question.
Yeah, you've been trained as both a historian and a journalist. I find that a fascinating juxtaposition with this, and a brilliant analysis in the books. In the book, I'm curious of the various stories that you tell in the book, and you're telling these stories through the lens of all these different people, and your own experience. What moved you most, and whose stories moved you the most, and whose stories or what stories taught you the most, or perhaps surprised you?
Well, I think there were a couple of stories that moved me the most. You know, I think one that will also move a lot of readers is that of the boy that I call in the book Paul. He was a foster child, and he was very much medicated against his will. He grew up in very difficult circumstances where he was abused. He couldn't even disclose all of the details of what happened to him because it was too psychologically painful for him. He still hasn't processed everything that went on in his biological parents' household. So he was taken from them almost immediately. He was put on medication for ADHD. He was acting out in foster homes. The different foster parents couldn't handle him. He was beating up other children. He was just intolerable. He bounced from house to house to house. They put him on progressively more heavy-duty medication, and you just feel so terrible for this kid, because what you see is, instead of him getting a loving family that really wants to take care of him, and instead of love and stability, you see him getting pills. And not only is he getting the pills, but he's not getting anybody sitting him down and explaining why he's getting the pills, which I think is so important. If you're going to give children medication, they really need to understand why. You can't just drug them up and not explain why they're taking these medications. So it's really awful. And when he looks back on that, he says he was drugged, which is a term that in general I don't like. I think it's a little melodramatic and sensationalistic, but I think in his case it maybe is fair to say. So I just think that's so sad. He just longed to be adopted. He just wanted somebody to love him. That's one story. The other is that of the character who I call Elizabeth. She's still struggling to find medication. Several of these young people actually are still struggling, but she in particular is really still struggling with some other health problems as well. And she's struggling to find psychiatric medications that she can integrate and have work with those other health problems. And just for years and years and years, she was trying different medications, couldn't get them to work, ongoing struggle. It wasn't really clear what exactly her problem was. And that is a recurring theme that I saw in a lot of people that I interviewed, and it was very difficult for them to contend with. I think if you're diagnosed with a single disorder, a single clear disorder, at least you can say, okay, I have a diagnosis. I have ADHD or I have depression. I'm going to accept that. You know, yes, it's a label, but you can choose to adopt the label or not adopt the label as you want. And you know why you're taking the medication, which again, as I say, I think is so important. If it's not clear what your problem is and you're just dealing with these really troubling symptoms and the doctors don't know what to do, or one doctor's calling it one thing and then you go to a different psychiatrist and he's calling it something else, or your symptoms are changing maybe over the years, I think that is so difficult, and I really, really sympathize with the young people who are going through that. This particular young woman, Elizabeth, was diagnosed initially as a young teenager with ADHD and depression, and those diagnoses changed over time, and it wasn't clear what was causing what. And even as I was interviewing her, it was clear she was really still struggling, and I really felt for her.
I'm curious if the experience of constantly visiting doctors might be or being dependent upon them ultimately. A lot of these kids, you described the withdrawal, the bounce, that might actually start a whole new round. If there's this sense among these kids in your generation who have grown up medicated that they have to depend on an older authority figure, that would be the doctor, how that is affecting the generation.
Yes, I think that's a great point. I think that at some point there's a lot of frustration. I think, not initially, but after a while you get a sense that almost that you know your disorder and you know your symptoms better than the doctor does. And a lot of this comes from the nature of our medical system, which is that you tend to change insurance a whole lot. And young people are very mobile, especially young adults. So we're moving from city to city, we're moving from job to job, and it probably does mean that we're also moving from doctor to doctor. Also, the nature of our medical care is that we have pediatric doctors and we have adult doctors. So that means that at a certain point, your pediatrician or your child psychiatrist who is prescribing your medication, as nice as they are, they're going to say, you know what, I'm sorry, I really can't see you anymore. And so there's so much transition there that you're not going to probably know your doctor all that well. And even the most patients, I think, are going to get a little frustrated and feel like they sort of know themselves better than the doctor does.
Yeah.
The other problem is that we see these 15-minute med checks, which that's, again, just part of the nature of care. And how is your psychiatrist or your general practitioner prescribing the medication going to get to really know you in that short period of time?
It's almost like they're like the foster kids bouncing around. We'll be right back. More conversations with great minds with Kaitlin Bell Barnett after the break. Welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds with Kaitlin Bell Barnett. Kaitlin is a journalist, blogger, and author. She writes about mental health topics for the Huffington Post and about young people's experiences with medications at My Meds Myself, a blog at the psychology website of Psych Central. And she's the author of the new book, Dosed, The Medication Generation Grows Up. Kaitlin, prognosis, looking forward, your generation, kids, young people in their 20s and early 30s, who were the first generation to even have psychoactive drugs available to them, and outside of alcohol and pot, but serious drugs that if you don't take them, you get a blowback, and you have to go to a doctor to see, and all these kind of things, these things that we've been talking about. Your generation, how do you think that experience is going to affect the middle age as your generation reaches into their 40s and 50s, or even their 30s, through their 30s? How do you think that that's going to affect them as they're moving through that phase of adulthood? And also, if I can throw a twofer at you here, might this have something to do, this being the first generation, the kind of the Prozac generation, the Ritalin generation, might that have something to do with why people are getting married so much later and why they're having children so much later than historically they have?
That's really interesting. Well, so for the first question, I think some of this will have to do with whether they stay on the medications or not. I think that's a huge question for a lot of people. They're trying to decide whether they should stay on the medications, and a lot of them are really trying to get off, and that's something that, incidentally, I did find in my research. A lot of us, I should say, since I take these medications as well myself and have since high school, we don't want to be on these drugs. It's no fun, and a lot of us have tried several times, in fact, not to be on the medications. So I think that's part of the question. Will they stay on the medications? Will they be able to get off? And will they find an alternative? Perhaps we'll have some reform of our healthcare system. Perhaps the healthcare reform bill will conceivably reform the structure and the reimbursement system so that maybe therapy is reimbursed a little more generously, perhaps, and not just medications are privileged, so that it'll be possible for many more people to actually try therapy as an option, which I support. So I think that's one question. Also, as another question, although I'm a little more skeptical about how quickly it'll happen, you know, will the big pharma develop other treatments, and how effective will those treatments be? You know, they are experimenting with gene therapy a little bit. That's, I think, pretty far down the road. But, you know, ECT is coming, electroconvulsive therapy is actually coming back into vogue and is much safer nowadays. So that's part of it. And I'm sorry, remind me of your second question.
Well, the second question was about people
married.
Yeah, getting married and having babies later. But if I can just interrupt you, you mentioned ECT. Yeah. I mean, this people it brings up kind of one flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of stuff. Aren't we? Isn't the subtext of all this that we're looking at a radical medicalization of an entire generation when previous generations rarely ever saw the doctor?
Yeah, I think that is one way of seeing it. I think that in some ways it's a medicalization that just is happening at a much younger age. I think, for instance, the baby boomers, they certainly see their share of doctors and they take their share of drugs. It just didn't happen at quite so young of an age. I think as far as getting married a little older, I think there are a lot of factors that play into that, but perhaps, you know, this could be one factor that many of my peers are still struggling. I don't think it has to just do with the fact that they're taking medication, but perhaps the fact that they maybe are struggling with some psychological disorders or psychological issues that they don't have fully worked out, and they, unlike in other generations, they feel they need to have those issues worked out. Whereas in previous generations, I'm not saying people didn't have those quote-unquote issues, but they would have just shunted them aside probably and gotten married anyway.
Mm-hmm. So to what, we talked about these drugs, people being on these drugs, shaping their experience as a kind of a culture. I'm curious to what extent it has caused them to lose experience, or perhaps even lose a sense of self, or lose contact with I hate to use the phrase genuine emotions because it implies there are non-genuine ones, but I don't have an alternative for that. But is there a sense of loss of self and a disconnection that comes with these?
I think some people do experience that. Some sort of emotional numbing is a well-known side effect of, especially, for instance, antidepressants. The antipsychotics that are being increasingly used, for example, now in younger children, and which are certainly being prescribed, if you look at the statistics, to people, for instance, in their 20s, I don't know that it's an emotional numbing so much as a general sort of sedation effect. People sometimes say they feel like they're quote-unquote drugged, just generally, or sedated. What's interesting is I've actually heard people describe something like that with ADHD medication, where they feel that they were more creative or more funny when they didn't take their stimulants. And that surprised me. Before I started doing my research, I didn't think that was going to be the case. And even quite young children will complain about that. So they even quite young children, is what I'm saying, do experience, I think, a sense of loss of aspects of their personality that they hold quite dear. The advantage with ADHD medication, of course, is that it's quite short acting. So if they want to get those parts of their personality back they can take what's called a medication vacation, which is maybe that's a little bit too lighthearted of a term, but it is something people use. They will just stop taking their medication over the summer, for example, when they don't need it for school, and they can, in sort of a weird way, get those parts of themselves back. That's a little harder to do with an antidepressant, where it takes weeks and weeks to work, and then it takes weeks for your body to readjust to not having it in your system.
Yeah. I'm curious, first of all, what are the numbers like? How many people and at what ages are on these kinds of drugs?
Well, you know, the numbers have been a little bit of a bête noire for me, I have to confess, doing my research. There's always quite a significant lag time for the epidemiologists who study this. They can't get their hands on the statistics, especially the national level statistics, until many years after the fact. So, and it's something like a 10-year lag time before they can even analyze the statistics, and I'm not quite sure why that is. The best kind of estimates that I can get is that in the 90s, you know, something like 6% of children were taking some kind of psychotropic drug, and I suspect that probably it was even a little higher than that it was slightly underreported, and that, you know, it increased from there. The latest, you know, statistics that we're seeing currently about adults, of course, you know, you're seeing the familiar, you know, slightly more than 1 in 10, for example, take an antidepressant, and we're seeing these large increases for drugs like atypical antipsychotics. To be honest, I have not seen the very latest statistics for children, and the percentage of children who very recently take psychotropic medication, and I think that's, again, because of this lag time.
Right. I'm curious if, when you were researching the book, you came across or bumped into any of the virulently anti-med folks, like the Scientologists, or the real evangelists for meds, the pharma reps or companies or PR flacks. You know, what was your experience with either of those, if you had one?
Yes, I did come across some of the Scientologists and some of those other groups, sort of the mind freedom type people. To be honest, I really tried to avoid people on both sides. I thought I had a pretty good sense of what the real zealots on either side were going to say. And what I was really interested in is hearing from the people in the middle, because I think that this does tend to turn into such a polarized debate. And what I'm interested in really is the nuance. And I don't really want to hear from the people who are pushing these drugs, the pharma reps, who I think have far too much influence already, and they certainly have huge ad dollars to spend, and they get their voices out there. And the Scientologists, I mean, I consider them incredibly fringe group, and you know, there are certainly people who have taken these medications and think that they're incredibly evil. I did talk to some people who have had very negative experiences with medication, so I don't want to say that I ignored them altogether. So I did try to take some of the more reasonable people in that group seriously, but like I say, I was really more interested in the people who took medications, were willing to give medications a try, but recognized that they were imperfect. And I was curious, you know, given that these are imperfect tools, what are the ways that they've affected you?
Yeah, it's a remarkable book and a remarkable reporting. Dosed, The Medication Generation Grows Up. Kaitlin Bell Barnett. Kaitlin, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Tom.
It's a pleasure. To see this and other Conversations with Great Minds, go to our website at conversationswithgreatminds.com.